And we have talked about this has been exposed to vacuum prior to docking, and we'll need to fill that space with air to make sure that pressure is equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and the International Space Station. Also putting away some hardware in the process, including the docking across. And Airs will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce that air into the vestibule. And flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor the pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is A-OK and leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. From that capture moment, which again was 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern over the North Atlantic. It takes roughly about 2 hours to get everything pressurized and checked out before we open up the hatches and welcome in Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station.
Commentator and SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Com check on the cabin mic.
Peggy, I have you loud and clear on the cabin mic on the big loop. Dragon, SpaceX on Dragon Aground. That call on the cabin mic actually came over Dragon Aground.
Thanks for the catch. We reconfigured.
This is Mission Control Houston as we continue to follow along the progress of the contact capture and beginning of hatch opening procedures as Axiom Mission 4 has arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. The soft capture and ring have been retracted and stowed away. The 12 hooks around the nose, the bulkhead there of the Dragon SpaceX connected to the pressurized mating adapter have latched on to create the hard mate. The umbilicals have been extended to allow for Dragon to run on power and communication lines provided by the International Space Station. And now looking at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time for welcome remarks. And shortly after, the Axiom Mission 4 team make their way through the hatchway and into the International Space Station. The docking procedures between the soft capture ring, the hooks, and umbilicals have been completed.
Station on the big loop. Node 2 overhead hatches open.
Houston copies.
And a good call there down from NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers saying that she has opened up the hatch for the Node 2 Zenith away the space-facing side of the Harmony module to give her access to the pressurized mating adapter. And there she will cruise in to begin work on the hatch opening procedures and pressurizing
Station and
the vestibule.
Dragon Houston on the Big Loop. We are troubleshooting the Big Loop audio comm issues from earlier, and the action we're about to take will take down Big Loop comm between ISS and the Axiom crew for about 5 minutes. We may require additional comm checks after.
Station copies.
Dragon copy.
Communications there on the Big Loop between the teams here in Houston and up to the International Space Station as they troubleshoot some communications. And the Big Loop that you have been hearing that have connected everyone here inside of Mission Control Houston and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, those aboard the space station and inside the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft, and the teams in Hawthorne, California, those 4 parties, that's the Big Loop. They will troubleshoot those communications for about 5 minutes and then recheck. But you heard just prior to that NASA astronauts Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers have begun the hatch opening procedures, in which the large hatch at the Node 2 zenith, that's the space-facing side of the Harmony module, has been opened, and that will allow for them to begin the hatch opening procedures and pressurize the vestibule, which is what, in addition to the comms checks, we will monitor, as Ayers will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. That's the gap between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station that has been exposed to vacuum. And from there, they will match the pressure, the atmosphere inside both station and Dragon. And this procedure for a hatch opening usually takes about 2 hours or so to perform leak checks and make sure every connection and everything
Houston
is safe
station
and sealed.
on the Big Loop. In step 2.4, the time is 10:56. The APAS equalization valve is back closed.
Houston copies. That's a good config. Expect at least 15 minutes before we continue.
Station copies.
And that communication between the International Space Station and the International Space Station Flight Control Room, and you heard the word APAS hatch. That is the hatch, again, that they will be operating and looking to open up from the space station side. But in doing so, they will need to pressurize, as we've been talking about, the vestibule, and then allow for the atmospheres to match between the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom Mission 4 crew, the vestibule itself, and the International Space Station, all equal throughout, to allow for the parties to pass through for the hatch opening and eventual welcome remarks. The contact for Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station about a half an hour ago at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern. And as they continue to configure the hatch opening procedures for NASA astronaut Anne McLean and Nicole Ayers, between the two of them, we'll continue to work those procedures, and we'll hear those communications throughout in anticipation of Axiom Mission 4 and Commander Peggy Whitson making her return to the International Space Station, her 5th flight, 2nd as a member of Axiom Space and the commander of Axiom at Mission 4, and her previous 3 as a NASA astronaut servicing key missions to the International Space Station. And a big part of the coming up in November, 25 years of continuous operations and humans on board the orbiting laboratory. And there she will welcome also first-time flyers and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA, and Tibor Kapu of HUNOR for Shukla, Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Kapu representing India, Poland, and Hungary. This will be those nations' first time visiting the orbiting laboratory. And with that, from Axiom Mission 1 through Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 11 different nations, showing how private astronaut missions truly expand access to the International Space Station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And on your screen, you see the clock counting upwards at the bottom, the T+, that is 1 day, 4 hours, 28 minutes, and now
SpaceX Dragon.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Dragon SpaceX comm check on Dragon to ground.
SpaceX Dragon from the cabin mic on Dragon to ground.
Peggy, I'm with you on Dragon to ground.
Okay, here. Did you call for me, or did I misunderstand?
I was returning your call.
Okay, stand by for inventory.
Copy, standing by.
comm checks and communications there between the teams in Hawthorne, California and SpaceX and the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft. As we heard earlier that they were troubleshooting some communications and looking to bring back on the big loop that connects the teams on the ground in SpaceX and NASA, as well as the teams in the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft itself.
SpaceX Dragon 4 inventory reporting on Dragon to ground.
And I'm with you on Dragon to ground. We are about to enter a LOS period for about 4 minutes, so we'll need to stand by.
Communications between SpaceX and the crew aboard the SpaceX Dragon and Grace spacecraft, saying they are upcoming on a period of LOS or loss of signal that's anticipated as the International Space Station and the spacecraft orbiting around the Earth and transfer of satellite signals. Right now, they are making their way over the southern Indian Ocean and about to head into a period of orbital nighttime, as we will get back views as soon as we have them. And again, the spacecraft carrying Axiom and Mission 4 and the 4 private astronauts contact with the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, and expected to continue with hatch opening procedures as they have already driven the hooks, connected the umbilicals for power and communications. And NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Ann McLean working on those hatch opening procedures as we speak. And that will allow the crew to make its way from Dragon into the International Space Station, going from a crew of 7 aboard the orbiting laboratory to a crew of 11. And that'll be followed by welcome remarks at approximately 8:35 a.m. Central Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern Time. Certainly an exciting moment for all of us here in Mission Control, but we want to check back in with our team over in Hawthorne as Axiom Mission 4 has arrived to the International Space Station.
For as many times as we have had the privilege of supporting crews headed to and from the International Space Station, I'm certain that it is an incomparable experience. Something that unless you're on board, you can't possibly understand what it really feels like. Paul, and I'm confident that you and I cannot do it justice even attempting to tell everyone joining us today about it. So instead, we have invited Axiom Space's own commander, Michael Lopez Alegria, to share from his previous experiences.
LA, MLA, or Commander, you've got a few designations, right? For those who may not know.
How you doing, Paul? Good to see you, Ronnie.
Hey, it's good to see you as well, sir. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So for those who may not know, I've got to share a few stats here just to make sure people understand who we have joining us today on the show. You've flown to space 6 times, 2 of those to Dragon, on Dragon for Axiom Space. You've got a running total of, say, 296 days, 16 hours and 15 minutes, give or take or so, in space. You've conducted 10 EVAs over the course of your career, and when you're not in space, you're helping get others at Axiom Space to space, right? As our chief astronaut. Do I have all of that right?
Sounds good. I'm not sure about the minutes and seconds, but everything else sounds right.
That's awesome. Well, we want to spend some time with you and just ask you some questions about your experiences getting to the International Space Station. Obviously, you know a thing or two about rendezvous and docking. So the first question is simply, we've just watched Dragon Grace dock to the space station. You've done this several times. What's the mindset for a crew at this point in the mission?
So as we get closer and closer, you know, we're transitioning from the phase where you're basically waiting to get to the ISS, and you're laser focused, especially the last 220 meters from what they call waypoint 1 into docking. A lot of focus on what's being shown on the displays. We have several parameters that we're monitoring: closure rate, the what they call the corridor, et cetera. There are a few things that could cause the system to stop or retreat or even break out, which means you'd come back and try to rendezvous on another day. So that's really what's going on, at least technically, I guess, in your mind. Obviously, emotionally, it's a completely different story. You know, you've been in there. In these cases, their cases, they've been in there for, you know, almost 30 hours since launch. Not a ton to do. And so they're very eager, I'm sure, to get aboard the ISS and start working.
So for you on your missions, say AX1 and AX3, what was this moment of the anticipation of the hatch opening? What was that like for you and your crew?
You know, like a lot of spaceflight, it's very busy and you're trying to juggle a couple of different emotions. I mean, obviously one is you've got a lot to do. They're getting out of their suits. They're putting on their flight suits to get across. They've got some reconfiguration of the onboard systems to take care of. So on that plane, you know, you're sort of focused on the task at hand. But secondarily, you're thinking, again, a lot about, you know, what it's taken to get here, what is this going to be like when I float aboard the ISS for the first time. So there's an emotional component that is also pretty strong. A lot going on.
So backing up even further, before you get to that kind of emotional moment of crossing the threshold, tell me a little bit more about the journey to get to that point. We on this end get to see launch, ascent, and then spacecraft separation. But after that, as you mentioned, you're kind of on your own. What are some of the hallmarks of your transit up to the station?
Yeah, as you know, Ronnie, from the time of post-orbital insertion, when the Dragon is configured for on-orbit operations, until you really start the approach initiation, you're basically playing catch-up. And I heard it greatly or very well explained by John yesterday on the broadcast during launch, that it's basically you're on the same lane as the ISS, but now you've got to catch up. And the way we catch up is by having an orbit with a lower altitude than the ISS. So we actually go around the Earth a little bit faster each time. And with each lap around the Earth, we get closer and closer. And so there's not a ton to do. Those maneuvers to adjust the orbital altitude, we call them burns. They happen, first of all, automatically. Of course, we are monitoring when they're going on. But between those things, there's not a ton to do. The Dragon is a very efficient spacecraft for what it is meant to do, which is transit to get you from the Earth to the ISS. but it's not really cut out to be an on-orbit anything really. So you're just sort of hanging out. They will have had a sleep period while they wait to get there. But there isn't a ton to do between those maneuvers. And so it's really kind of a hurry up and wait. Again, a lot like a lot of human spaceflight, very intense activities followed by some pretty long lulls occasionally.
And so then when do you get to go from that free flying like transit mode to the rendezvous and docking phase?
Yeah, so after that series of maneuvers to change the altitude, we start approach initiation. And I would say that the transition is really when the spacecraft starts pointing at the ISS. Until then, the attitude is really optimized for power and communications considerations. But when it gets beyond a certain point, it starts actually looking at the ISS, and then you start being able to pick it up in the displays through the forward-looking cameras that are on board.
LA, you've described the moment of getting into microgravity as you've transitioned into another plane, another world, another moment. Can you share a little bit of that thought, that mindset as you transition from obviously the acceleration of launch into microgravity and being in that other world? I'd love to hear your perspective on that transition.
Yeah, you know, Paul, it's interesting. I mean, it really is kind of like a parallel universe in a way. We all live our lives in 1G pretty much our entire lives. But when you make that transition, it really is a very different sensation. For the first time you feel it, you can't even believe it. I mean, it's a little bit like the 0G airplane that we are trained in, but of course, instead of lasting 20 seconds or so, it lasts effectively forever. And so that sensation, I mean, it just brings a smile to your face when you let go of something and it just stays hovering in front of you. And it just never gets old. It's really quite remarkable.
I love it. And obviously our crew in Dragon right now is in that other plane, in that other world of microgravity being constant. So we're walking forward. We're progressing towards this moment where the hatch will open and they are going to enter the space station. You've mentioned this already a little bit, but I'd love to just kind of unpack that some more. What is it like to just kind of float through that hatch and realize you're no longer in Dragon, you're now in the station?
Yeah, think about the experience that these guys have had. I mean, they've been training in the mock-ups that look just like the ISS, but you're obviously walking around in there, you're not floating. So now they've experienced microgravity, but in the fairly confined spaces of the spacecraft. Once the hatch is open, it's a special moment, and as a commander, you really never get to see it because generally they go in first. But you can just feel their wonder as they float across the hatch, and they are actually in that environment that on the one hand looks so familiar, but in a different way feels very different because now you're floating and not walking through it. It's a similar experience, and I remember on AX-1 when the three first-time flyers saw the Earth from the first time from the Dragon spacecraft after we got into orbit. And again, I didn't see their faces because they were glued to the windows, but I could just feel, hear, and sense how excited they are, and it's a magical feeling. And I'm looking forward to to trying to perceive what that must be like for these three as they float aboard the ISS.
One of the things we're really looking forward to with this crew is the welcome ceremony that's going to be today at 8:35 a.m. Central. Tell us a little bit about the history or the tradition associated with welcoming a new crew on board.
Yeah, that goes back obviously 25 years or so when we first started having handovers aboard the ISS. But recently what we've done is added a pinning ceremony to that, and that is where Peggy, as a commander, will provide astronaut pins to the three new flyers, Shuk, Slav, and Tibor. And those pins will have a number associated with them, which is the number of orbital astronaut they are. So they will be the 634th, 35th, and 36th humans to have orbited the Earth in the history of humanity. So when you think about it, it's a pretty small number considering humans have been around quite a while. But it's pretty nice, and of course, to be greeted by the onboard crew, all 7 of them, lots of hugs, lots of different languages being spoken, and a lot of smiles.
And So then after you have this great welcome moment, sharing all of that across different cultures, different teams, how quickly do you transition then to working together on station?
Pretty quickly. You really have to hit the ground running. There are a few safety things that we go through with the ISS commander where they'll tell us some things that, of course, they have learned in the mock-ups again, but now this is for real. These are where things are located. This is what we expect you to do if this or that goes wrong. And then really it's off to work. We start transferring a lot of cargo out of the ISS. Most of that will be to support various scientific experiments that we're bringing on board. And then our lives get ruled by what we call the Optimus viewer, which is basically a moving map of your schedule from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. And it's pretty hectic. You know, you've got, in this case, 14 days to get a lot of stuff done. Every detail is pre-programmed by the teams on the ground working with NASA. And we really have an effort to try to maintain that pace. Obviously, it takes a bit of time to get accustomed to floating around. Even though they've been in zero-G for over a day, they haven't been in zero-G in such a big open space. And so moving around, you've heard the term or the phrase slow is smooth and smooth is fast. They definitely will be practicing that. So there's a little bit of time for adaptation. There's quite a bit of time with the safety briefings that I mentioned. But after that, it's looking at Optimus Viewer and really getting started.
LA, you've just mentioned that that schedule is full and you jump right on into it, trying to stay ahead of that red line in that Optimus map you mentioned. But I'm curious, just looking back at AX3, your previous mission, what were some of the highlights for you personally on board the space station?
We've learned a lot since AX1 and the progression through AX3. And I think one of the things we learned is that we really need to focus the commander's time on being available to the other crew members. So I would say one of the most gratifying things is giving them the time and space to sort of inhale, exhale, think about what they're doing and take their time, because really the planners have done a great job fitting all of these activities into these 14 days. And there is enough time to do it. It doesn't do anybody good to get flustered and upset. You just go one step at a time, and then letting them have a little bit of time to look out that window, because that is a view that is spectacular and unforgettable. I think my advice to the crew would be, you have a huge responsibility. Your families, your colleagues, your space agencies, your nations are really counting on you. But at the same time, try to enjoy it. Try to really soak this in. This is generally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And again, it's that balance between, you know, sort of the focused, hard nails, technical work and trying to really absorb the emotional experience, which is obviously very unique.
Unique indeed. You just mentioned there that there's lessons to be learned that you share out with each of the crew members. And I know that you got a chance to do that with this crew and ahead of their launch, I believe, in quarantine. So I'm curious if you could share some of those lessons learned with us. If you were preparing to take us up next, what would you share with us?
Well, the good news is that, you know, Peggy has done this a time or two herself, and her crew will probably be as ready as anyone that you can imagine. So my time with this crew was pretty short and pretty informal because of A, her experience, and B, the training that, as I mentioned, has evolved since AX1 to the point that I think we have it pretty well suitcased in terms of what to train, what not to train, and how much of each. Again, my advice to them is try to absorb it, try to be as cognizant of what's going on, because it is that parallel universe, again, that's hard to get to. And the more of that you can sort of soak away in the recesses of your mind, the better, because I'm quite convinced that this crew in particular